heights where other SD men with submachine guns fired from the edge of the trench. Because I was a group leader and could move about more freely, I went once directly to the execution site and saw how the newly arriving Jews had to lie down on those already shot. They were then likewise shot with bursts from the submachine guns. The SD men took care that the Jews were shot in such a way that there were inclines in the piles of corpses, enabling the newcomers to lie down on corpses piled as much as 3 meters high. The whole business was the most gruesome I had ever seen in my life, because I was frequently able to see that after a burst had been fired, the Jews were only wounded, and those still living were more or less buried alive beneath the corpses of those shot later, without the wounded being given so-called mercy shots. I remember that from out of the piles of corpses, the SS left bracket sick right bracket men were cursed by the wounded 31. The other policemen were long inured to the mass killing of Jews, and few were as impressed as Ditmold by the Ernstefest massacres. What they did find new and impressive, however, was the problem, hitherto confined to the relative secrecy of the death camps, of disposing of so many corpses. Wilhelm Gebhardt *, who was part of Nade's Special Guard Company that remained in Lublin after the killing, recalled in Lublin itself, it stank terribly for days. It was the typical smell of burned bodies. Anyone could imagine that a great number of Jews were burned in the camp at Majdanek 32 if the inhabitants of Lublin only had to smell the burning corpses at a distance. Many members of 3rd Company had a much more immediate experience with the disposal of bodies at Poniatowa. As Poniatowa was a mere 35 kilometers south of Putai, the men of the company sometimes had occasion to go there, and some were in fact assigned to guard the work Jews who had the gruesome task of disinterment and body burning. The policemen could observe in detail how the bodies were taken from the trenches, pulled to the burning site by horses, placed on a grill of iron rails by Jewish workers, and burned. A bestial stench dominated the area 33. A truckload of policemen once stopped at the camp while the burning was in progress. Some of our comrades got sick from the smell and sight of the half-decomposed corpses, so they had to throw up all over the truck. 34 When 3rd Company's new commander, Captain Haslich * heard the reports from his returning men, he found them unbelievable, and said to First Sergeant Carlson, "Come, we'll go there and have a look for ourselves." When they arrived, the work was already done, but an obliging SS officer showed them the graves and burning grill of iron rails some 4 by 8 meters 35. At the conclusion of the Ernstefest massacres, the district of Lublin was for all practical purposes Judenfrei. The murderous participation of Reserve Police Battalion 101 in the final solution came to an end. With a conservative estimate of 6,500 Jews shot during earlier actions, like those at J6ZEF, 6W and Lomazi, and 1,000 shot during the Jew hunts, and a minimum estimate of 30,500 Jews shot at Majdanek and Poniatowa, the battalion had participated in the direct shooting deaths of at least 38,000 Jews. With the death camp deportation of at least 3,000 Jews from Mijayerzyk in early May 1943, the number of Jews they had placed on trains to Treblinka had risen to 45,000. For a battalion of less than 500 men, the ultimate body count was at least 83,000. 16 Aftermath. With the battalion's contribution to the final solution complete and the tide of war turning against Germany, the men of Reserve Police Battalion J01 increasingly found themselves in action against armed partisans and enemy soldiers. In the spring of 1943, the battalion experienced a rare casualty when First Lieutenant Hagen was killed accidentally by police gun J fire. In the last year of the war, the toll among the officers' vertical bar rose dramatically. Lieutenants Nade Hoppner and Peters fell in action, and Lieutenant Drucker returned to Germany. Ex-wounded 1 Major Trapp also returned to Germany in early 1944 too. A few of the men were captured by the advancing Russian army, but most made their way back to Germany as the Third Reich collapsed in defeat. Many resumed their pre-war occupations. For the 2 SS Hauptsturmführers, Hoffmann and Wolof, as well as 12 from the sample of 32 non-commissioned officers, this meant an ongoing career in the police. Another 12 policemen from the rank and file sample of 174 managed to put their reserve service to good use and made a post-war career in the police. Not surprisingly, the interrogations contained little information about the ease with which these 26 men continued in the police. While only 2 of the reservists had been party members, 9 of the NCOs had belonged, and 3 had been in the SS as well. Hoffman and Wolof, of course, had also been in both the party and the SS. Hoffman mentioned a brief period of internment by the British due to his SS membership. Though interrogated by Polish authorities, he was released and immediately rejoined the Hamburg Police 3. Ironically, it was not the hardcore SS officers who suffered post-war difficulties because of Reserve Police Battalion 101's actions in Poland, but Major Trapp and Lieutenant Buchmann. One policeman who had been in the firing squad at Telsin was denounced by his estranged wife. Under interrogation, he named his battalion commander, Trapp, his company commander, Buchmann, and his first sergeant, Kammer. All of them were extradited to Poland in October 1947. On July 6, 1948, they had a one-day trial in the city of Siedlce. The trial focused solely on the reprisal shooting of 78 Poles in Telsin, not on any of the battalion's murderous and far more numerous actions against Polish Jews. The policeman and Trapp were sentenced to death and executed in December 1948. Buchmann was sentenced to 8 years in prison and Kammer to 3. For Reserve Police Battalion 101 was not subjected to further judicial investigation until the 1960s. In 1958, the Zentralstelle der Landesjustizverwaltung, Central Agency for the State Administrations of Justice, headquartered in the town of Ludwigsburg, just north of Stuttgart, was formed to initiate and coordinate the prosecution of Nazi crimes. The staff of the Zentralstelle was organized into various task forces each. Aftermath/145, assigned to investigate various crime complexes. Only after they had conducted the initial research into a particular crime complex and discovered the whereabouts of the highest-ranking suspects did they assign jurisdiction to the Office of the State Prosecutor of the federal state in which the prime suspect or suspects lived. It was in the course of investigating various crime complexes in the district of Lublin that Ludwigsburg investigators first encountered several witnesses from Reserve Police Battalion 101. In 1962, the case was turned over to police and judicial authorities in Hamburg, where most of the surviving battalion members still lived. From late 1962 to early 1967, 210 former members of the battalion were interrogated, many of them more than once. 14 men were indicted. Captains Hoffman and Wolof, Lieutenant Drucker, Sergeants Steinmetz, Bentheim, Beckmeyer, and Grund, Corporals Grafnan * and Miller *, and 5 reserve policemen. The trial began in October 1967, and the verdict was rendered the following April. Hoffman, Wolof, and Drucker were sentenced to 8 years, Bentheim to 6, Beckmeyer to 5. Grafnan and the 5 reserve policemen were declared guilty, but at the judge's discretion, under a provision of the 1940 Criminal Code that governed the trial, so as to avoid the criticism leveled at the Nuremberg trials of applying ex post facto law. They were given no sentence. Grunstein, Metz, and Miller were not included in the verdict, as their cases had been separated during the trial because of their failing health. A lengthy appeals process finally concluded in 1972. The convictions of Bentheim and Beckmeyer were upheld, but they also received no sentence. Hoffman's sentence was reduced to 4 years, Drucker's to 3.5 years. The case pending against other members of the battalion was dropped by the prosecution in light of its inability to get sentences against any but 3 defendants in the first trial. However inadequate the post-war judicial outcome may seem at first sight, it must be kept in mind that the investigation of Reserve Police Battalion 101 was one of the few that led to the trial of any former members of the Order Police. Most of the investigations of police battalions did not even lead to indictments. In the few cases that did come to trial, only a handful of convictions were obtained. Comparatively speaking, the investigation and trial of Reserve Police Battalion 101 was a rare success for German judicial authorities attempting to deal with the police battalions. The interrogations of 210 men from Reserve Police Battalion 101 remain in the archives of the Office of the State Prosecutor in Hamburg. They constitute the prime, indeed indispensable, source for this study. It is to be hoped that the admirable efforts of the prosecution in preparing this case will serve history better than they have served justice. Germans, Poles, and Jews. He pre-trial and courtroom testimonies of the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 must of course be used with considerable caution. Problems of judicial calculation involving self-incrimination and incrimination of comrades weighed heavily upon each witness. The effects of 25 years of memory loss and distortion, even when not feigned for judicial convenience, were equally important. Psychological defense mechanisms, especially repression and projection, crucially hyped the testimony as well. Nowhere do all these qualifications greater than at the reliability of the testimonies become more problematic than in connection with the fateful triangle of German-Polish-Irish relations. Simply put, the portrayal of German-Polish and German-Jewish relations in these testimonies is extraordinarily exculpatory. In contrast, the portrayal of Polish-Jewish relations is extraordinarily damning. If we begin by examining the first two relationships as described by the former policeman, we can better see the asymmetry and distortion involved in their account of the third. Concerning German-Polish relations, the most salient feature is the scarcity of any comment. The men make general references to partisans, bandits, and robbers, but the thrust of their comments is not the specifically anti-German character of such phenomena. On the contrary, they depict banditry as an endemic problem that predated the German occupation of Poland. Thus they invoke the presence of partisans and bandits in two ways. On the one hand, to imply that the Germans were protecting Poles from an indigenous problem of lawlessness, and on the other hand, to obscure the frequency and intensity of the battalion's anti-Jewish activities by alleging that partisans and bandits, not Jews, were the chief preoccupation of the policemen. Some of the witnesses referred to specific attempts at maintaining good German-Polish relations. Captain Hoffman explicitly boasted of friendly relations between his company and the native population in Pufai. He claimed that he filed charges against Lieutenant Messman because the shoot-on-sight tactics of the latter's marauding motorized gendarmerie were embittering the Poles. One Lieutenant Buchman noted that Major Trapp carried out the selection of victims for the Towson reprisal shootings in consultation with the Polish town mayor. Care was taken to shoot only strangers and the destitute, not citizens of good standing. To this picture of a rather benign German occupation in Poland was contradicted by only two testimonies. Bruno Probst recalled early activities of the battalion in Poznari and Lodz in 194Q41, when the policemen carried out brutal expulsions and amused themselves with cruel harassments of the local population. He was even more critical of German treatment of Poles in 1942. Even at that time, denunciations, or comments from envious neighbors, sufficed for Poles to be shot along with their entire families, on the mere suspicion of possessing weapons, or hiding Jews or bandits. As far as I know, Poles were never arrested and turned over to the competent police authorities on these grounds. From my own observations, and from the stories of my comrades, I recall that when the above-mentioned grounds for suspicion were at hand, we always shot Poles on the spot. 3. The second witness, to challenge the rosy view of German-Polish relations, was not a surviving policeman, but the wife of Lieutenant Brand, who had visited him briefly in Rajiri. At the line, it was quite usual, she said, even for German civilians, to nothing of uniformed policemen, to behave toward the Poles as a master race. For instance, when Germans walked a sidewalk in town, Poles were to step aside. When Germans entered a shop, Polish customers were expected to leave. One day, her way was barred by some hostile Polish greater than men in Rajiri. She and her companion got away only by returning to call for the police. When Major Trapp heard of the incident, he was incensed. The Polish women should be shot in a public marketplace, he declared. According to Frau Brand, incident was illustrative of the German attitude toward the Karatols. For in terms of sexual relations between German policemen and Polish women, there were only 2 references. Hoffman meant to have protected one of his men by not reporting a case of venereal disease contracted through forbidden intercourse with the Pole. 5 Another policeman was not so fortunate. He spent New Year in a punishment camp for violating the ban on sexual nations with Poles. 6 The very existence of such a ban, of course, why a great deal about the reality of German-Polish relations so conveniently omitted from the bulk of the testimony. Could the German policemen have done to the Poles what they did to the Jews? Though on a much smaller scale, the same process of growing callousness and indifference to Polish life seems to have set in. In September 1942 in Towson, the battalion was still cautious about the effect of reprisal shootings of large numbers of Poles. After killing 78 expendable Poles, Trapp met his reprisal quota by shooting Jews instead. Bruno Probst recalled a different attitude prevailing by January 1943. As Hoppner's 2nd platoon of 3rd Company was about to go to the movies in Opole, they received reports that a German policeman had been shot by Polish assailants. Hoppner took his men to the village of Niezd 6W to carry out a reprisal, only to discover that all but the most elderly inhabitants had fled. Even though word came in the middle of the action that the German policeman had only been wounded and not killed, Hoppner had all 12 to 15 elderly Poles, mostly women, shot and the village burned down. The men then returned to the movie theater in Opole. 7 The testimony is marked by similar omissions concerning German attitudes toward Jews. One reason for this is a stark legal consideration. According to German law, among the criteria for defining homicide as murder is the presence of a base motive, such as racial hatred. Any member of the battalion who openly confessed to anti-Semitism would have seriously compromised his legal position. Anyone who talked about the anti-Semitic attitudes of others risked finding himself in the uncomfortable position of witness against his former comrades. But this reluctance to discuss anti-Semitism was also part of a much more general and pervasive reticence about the whole phenomenon of National Socialism and the policemen's own political attitudes, or those of their comrades during that period. To admit an explicitly political or ideological dimension to their behavior, to concede that the morally inverted world of National Socialism, so at odds with the political culture and accepted norms of the 1960s, had made perfect sense to them at the time, would be to admit that they were political and moral eunuchs, who simply accommodated to each successive regime. That was a truth with which few either wanted or were able to come to grips. Captain Hoffman, who joined the Nazi high school studentization at 16, the Hitler Youth at 18, and both party and the SS at 19, offered the usual denial of the political and ideological dimension. My entry into the General in May 1933 is explained by the feat that at that time the SS, seen as a purely defensive formation, no special ideologically ed attitude on my part, lay at the root of my entry. Considerably less dishonest, though still evasive, was the expiation of Lieutenant Drucker, the only defendant who seriously attempted to grapple with the problem of his past attitude. I received National Socialist ideological training only within the framework of training in the SA, and a certain influence was present from the propaganda of the time. Because I was a platoon leader in the Naval SA, and it was desirable at the time that platoon leaders were also party members, I entered the party shortly before the outbreak of the war. Under the influence of the times, my attitude to Jews was marked by a certain aversion. But I cannot say that I especially hated Jews. In any case, it is my impression now that that was my attitude at that time. 9. The few cases in which policemen testified to the brutality and anti-Semitism of others usually involved comments about Partick officers by men from the ranks. With some reluctance, for Tanz, witnesses admitted that Knade was a brutal, sadistic Kurd who was a Nazi and anti-Semite out of conviction. Sergeants were also the subject of quite negative comments. Several testimonies. Rudolf Grund, who deputized for Buchen when the latter was excused from participating in Jewish-ons, was nicknamed the Poison Dwarf because he campaigned for his short stature by screaming at his men. He was characterized as especially harsh and loud, a real go-getter, a 110% Nazi, who displayed great zeal for duty. 10 Heinrich Beckemeyer was described as a unpleasant man, who proudly wore his Nazi insignia at all times. Disliked by his men, he was especially feared by Poles and Jews, toward whom he was brutal and cruel. One of his men recounted how Beckemeyer forced a group of Jews near Lomazzi to crawl through a mud puddle while singing. When an exhausted old man collapsed and raised his hands to Beckemeyer, begging for mercy, the sergeant shot him in the mouth. Heinrich Beckemeyer, the witness concluded, was a common dog. 11 But such denunciations by the policemen, even of unpopular superiors, much less of their comrades, were extremely rare. A range of attitudes toward Jews is revealed in less direct and less guarded statements made during the interrogations. For instance, when asked how they could tell the difference between Poles and Jews in the countryside, some of the men cited clothing, hairstyle, and general appearance. Several, however, chose a vocabulary that still reflected the Nazi stereotype of 25 years earlier. The Jews were dirty, unkempt, and less clean, in comparison to the Poles. 12 The comments of other policemen reflected a different sensibility that recognized the Jews as victimized human beings. They were dressed in rags and half-starved. 13 A similar dichotomy is reflected in descriptions of Jewish behavior at the shooting sites. Some stressed Jewish passivity, occasionally in a very exculpatory way, that seemed to imply that the Jews were complicit in their own deaths. There was no resistance, no attempt to escape. The Jews accepted their fate. They practically lay down to be shot without waiting to be told. 14 In other descriptions, the emphasis was clearly on the dignity of the victims. The composure of the Jews was astonishing and unbelievable. L5 The few references to sexual relations between Germans and Jews give a picture very different from forbidden romance, or even quick sexual gratification, between German policemen and Polish women. In cases involving German men and Jewish women, it was a question of domination over the powerless, of rape and voyeurism. The one policeman who was witnessed attempting to rape a Jewish woman was in fact the same man who, later denounced by his wife to Allied occupation authorities, cited to Poland and tried with Trapp, Buchmann, and Mayer. The witnessing NCO did not report the rapist. 16 The ND case involved Lieutenant Peters, who would get drunk vodka in the evening and make night patrols in the ghetto. Ted and spurred he entered Jewish dwellings, tore the covers off women, looked, and then left. By morning he was 17 again. For the most part, the Jews remained an anonymous collective, the German accounts. There were 2 exceptions. First, the Leisman frequently mentioned encountering German Jews were almost always able to remember exactly the hometown which the Jew in question came. The decorated World War Caret veteran from Bremen, the mother and daughter from Kassel, movie theater owner from Hamburg, the Jewish consulate from Munich. The experience must have been quite expected and jarring, in sharp contrast to their usual view of Jews as part of a foreign enemy, to have remained in their memories so vividly. The other Jewish victims, who took on a personal identity in eyes of the German policemen, were those who worked for him, particularly in the kitchen. One policeman remembered earning extra rations for the Jewish work detail he supervised Lukau, because the Jews received practically nothing at all, even though they had to work for us. The same man meant to have allowed the wife of the head of the Jewish ghetto lice to escape when the ghetto was being cleared. 18 In ICARET-DZYRZEC, a kitchen worker begged another policeman to save our mother and sister during a ghetto clearing, and he let her gang them to the kitchen as well. 19 In Kok, a policeman countered a weeping Jewish woman during the late September looting and sent her to the kitchen. 20 But the tenuous relations that developed between the police and their Jewish kitchen helpers seldom saved lives in the end. And his 2 kitchen helpers did not come to work during a deportation from Lukau. One policeman went to the collection point. He found both, but the SS man in charge allowed only one to go. A short while later, she was taken to 21. Most vividly of all, the policemen remembered those occasions when they not only did not save their Jewish workers, but in feet were supposed to carry out the executions themselves. In Pufoy, Captain Hoffman summoned Corporal Nering to his bedroom, gave him a gift of good wine, and told him to go to the agricultural estate he had formerly guarded, and shoot the Jewish workers. Nering complained of the assignment, because he personally knew many of the Jewish workers there, but to no avail. He and his unit shared the assignment with a gendarmerie officer and 4 or 5 men also stationed in Pufoy. Nering told the officer that many of the Jews were well known to him, and he could not take part in the shooting. More obliging than Hoffman, the officer had his men shoot the 15 to 20 Jews on their own so that Nering did not have to be present. 22 in Koktu, Jewish kitchen workers, Bluma and Ruth, asked for help to escape. One policeman advised them that it was pointless, but others helped them get away. 23 2 weeks later, some of the policemen found Bluma and Ruth hiding in a bunker, along with a dozen other Jews. One of the men, who recognized them, tried to leave because he knew what was coming. He was ordered to shoot them instead. He refused and left anyhow, but all the Jews in the bunker, including the former kitchen helpers, were shot. 24 in KOMAR, 6 WKA Drucker's 2nd Platoon of 2nd Company, had 2 Jewish kitchen workers, known as Judah and Harry. One day Drucker said they could not stay any longer, and there was nothing left to do but shoot them. Some of the policemen took Judah to the woods and engaged her in conversation, before she was shot from behind. Shortly thereafter, Harry was shot in the back of the head, with a pistol while he was picking berries. 25 The policemen had clearly taken extra pains to shoot unawares victims, who had prepared their food over the past months, and whom they knew by name. By 1942 standards of German Jewish Jashen's a quick death, without the agony of anticipation, was considered an example of human compassion. While the policemen's testimonies offer scant information concerning German attitudes toward Poles and Jews, they attain very frequent and quite damning comment on Polish attitudes toward Jews. At least 2 factors must be kept in mind in evaluating this testimony. First, the German police quite truly had considerable contact with Poles, who collaborated the final solution and helped them track down Jews. Indeed, Poles attempted to curry favor with the German occupiers, neither zealous anti-Semitism. Needless to say, Poles who helped Jews did their very best to remain totally unknown to the Germans. Thus there was an inherent bias in the sympathies and behavior of the Poles with whom the German policemen had first-hand experience. This inherent one-sidedness is, in my opinion, further distorted a second factor. It is fair to speculate that a great deal of subjection was involved in German comments on Polish anti-Semitism. Often unwilling to make accusatory statements about their comrades, or to be truthful about themselves, these men must have found considerable psychological relief in sharing blame with the Poles. Polish misdeeds could be spoken about light frankly, while discussion about Germans was quite rigid. Indeed, the greater the share of Polish guilt, the less remained on the German side. In weighing the testimony that allows, these reservations must be borne in mind. The litany of German accusation against the Poles began, like _ mass murder itself, with the account of J6ZEF6W. The Polish lawyer provided flasks of schnapps to the Germans on the marketplace, according to one policeman 26, according to others, rolls helped wrest Jews from their dwellings, and revealed Jewish hiding places, in garden bunkers, or behind double walls. Even after the Germans had finished searching, Poles continued bring individual Jews to the marketplace throughout the afternoon. They entered Jewish houses, and began to plunder as soon as the Jews were taken away. They plundered the Jewish corpses. When the shooting was over 27, the classic accusation was made by Captain Hoffman, a man who claimed to remember absolutely nothing about the massacre his company had carried out at Konskaola. In contrast, he remembered the following, in exquisite detail. After the outer cordon had been lifted, and his third company had moved into the town center, at J6ZEF6W, 2 Polish students invited him into their house for a vodka. The young Poles exchanged Greek and Latin verses with Hoffman, but did not hide their political views. Both were Polish nationalists, who expressed themselves angrily over how they were treated, and thought that Hitler had only one redeeming feature, that he was liberating them from the Jews. 28 Virtually no account of the Jew hunts, omitted the feat that Hideouts and bunkers were for the most part revealed by Polish agents, informants, forest runners, and angry peasants. But the policeman's word choice revealed more than just information about Polish behavior. Time and again they used the word betrayed, with its unquestionable connotation of strong moral condemnation. 29. Most explicit in this regard was Gustav Michelson. I found it very disturbing, at the time, that the Polish population betrayed these Jews, who had hidden themselves. The Jews had camouflaged themselves very well in the forest, in underground bunkers, or in other hiding places, and would never have been found, if they had not been betrayed, by the Polish civilian population. 30. Michelson belonged to the minority of weak policemen, who never shot, and could thus voice his moral criticism, with less than total hypocrisy. The same cannot be said for most others, who accused the Poles of betrayal, never mentioning that it was German policy to recruit such people and reward such behavior. Once again it was the ruthlessly honest Bruno Probst who put the matter in more balanced perspective. Often the Jew hunts were instigated by tips from Polish informants, he noted. But he added, I further remember that at that time we also gradually began more systematically than before to shoot Poles who provided lodging to Jews. Almost always we burned down their forms at the same time. 31. Aside from the policeman, who testified about the Polish woman who was surrendered by her filther and shot for hiding Jews in her cellar in Koch, Probst was the sole man, among 210 witnesses, to acknowledge the existence of a German policy of systematically shooting Poles who hid Jews. Probst also related another story. On one occasion Lieutenant I. Hoppner was leading a patrol that uncovered a bunker with 10 Jews. A young man stepped forward and said that he was a Pole who had hidden there in order to be with his bride. Hoppner gave him the choice of leaving or being shot with his Jewish wife. The Pole stayed and was shot. Probst concluded that Hoppner vertical bar never meant the offer seriously. The Pole would certainly have been shot trying to escape if he had decided to leave. 32. Vertical bar. The German policeman described other examples of Polish complicity. At Koryskowola, one policeman in the cordon was approached by a woman dressed as a Polish peasant. The nearby Poles said that she was a Jew in disguise, but the policeman let her pass anyhow. 33. A number of policemen told of Poles arresting and holding Jews until the Germans could come and shoot them. 34. On several occasions, the Jews had been beaten when the Germans arrived. 35. Only one witness, however, told of Polish policemen accompanying the German patrols and taking part in the shooting on 2 occasions. 36. In contrast, Tony Bentheim recounted what happened when the Polish police, in KOMAR 6 WKA, reported that they had captured 4 Jews. Drucker ordered Bentheim to shoot them. After he had taken the Jews to the cemetery, where he intended to shoot all 4 by himself, his submachine gun jammed. He thereupon asked the Polish policeman who had accompanied him if he wanted to take care of it. To my surprise, however, he refused. Bentheim used his pistol. 37. The German portrayals of Polish complicity are not false. Tragically, the kind of behavior they attributed to Poles is confirmed in other accounts, and occurred all too often. The Holocaust, after all, is a story with far too few heroes, and all too many perpetrators and victims. What is wrong with the German portrayals is a multifaceted distortion in perspective. The policemen were all but silent about Polish help to Jews and German punishment for such help. Almost nothing was said of the German role in inciting the Polish betrayals the policemen so hypocritically condemned. Nor was any note made of the fact that large units of murderous auxiliaries, the notorious Huis, were not recruited from the Polish population, in stark contrast to other nationalities, in pervasively anti-Semitic Eastern Europe. In some ways, therefore, the German policeman's comments about Poles reveal as much about the former as the latter. Ordinary men hided most men in Reserve Police Battalion, 101 me killers, while only a minority of perhaps 10% certainly no more than 20% did not. A number of illinations have been invoked in the past to explain such behavior. Wartime brutalization, racism, segmentation and Rauization of the task, special selection of the perpetrators, heroism, obedience to orders, deference to authority, ideologue indoctrination, and conformity. These factors are applicable, varying degrees, but none without qualification. Wars have invariably been accompanied by atrocities, as John Dyer has noted in his remarkable book, War Without Mercy. Race and power in the Pacific War. War hates induce war crimes. One above all when deeply embedded negative racial 159. Stereotypes are added to the brutalization inherent in sending armed men to kill one another on a massive scale. The fragile tissue of war conventions and rules of combat is even more frequently and viciously broken on all sides. Hence the difference between more conventional war between Germany and the Western Allies, for example, and the race wars of the recent past. From the Nazi war of destruction in Eastern Europe and war against the Jews to the war without mercy in the Pacific and most recently Vietnam, soldiers have all too often tortured and slaughtered unarmed civilians and helpless prisoners and committed numerous other atrocities. Dyer's account of entire American units in the Pacific openly boasting of a take-no-prisoners policy and routinely collecting body parts of Japanese soldiers as battlefield souvenirs is chilling reading for anyone who smugly assumes that war atrocities were a monopoly of the Nazi regime. War, and especially race war, leads to brutalization, which leads to atrocity. This common thread, it could be argued, runs from Bromberg to and Babi Yar, through New Guinea and Manila and on to My Lai. But if war, and especially race war, was a vital context within which Reserve Police Battalion 101 operated as, I shall indeed argue how much does the notion of wartime brutalization explain the specific behavior of the policemen at J6ZEF, 6W and after. In particular, what distinctions must be made between various kinds of war crimes and the mindsets of the men who commit them. Many of the most notorious wartime atrocities Orador and Malmedy, the Japanese rampage through Manila, the American slaughter of prisoners and mutilation of corpses on many Pacific islands, and the massacre at My Lai, involved a kind of battlefield frenzy. Soldiers who were inured to violence, numbed to the taking of human life, embittered over their own casualties, and frustrated by the tenacity of an insidious and seemingly inhuman enemy, sometimes exploded, and at other times grimly resolved to have their revenge at the first opportunity. Though atrocities of this land were too often tolerated, condoned, or tacitly, sometimes even explicitly, encouraged by elements of the command structure, they did not represent official government policy. 3. Despite the hate-filled propaganda of each nation, and the exterminatory rhetoric of many leaders and commanders, such atrocities still represented a breakdown in discipline and the chain of command. They were not standard operating procedure, other lands of atrocity, lacking the immediacy of battlefield frenzy, and fully expressing official government policy, decidedly were standard operating procedure. The firebombing of German and Japanese cities, the enslavement and murderous maltreatment of foreign laborers in German camps and factories, or along the Siam-Burma Railroad, the reprisal shooting of 100 civilians for every German soldier killed by partisan attack in Yugoslavia or elsewhere in Eastern Europe. These were not the spontaneous explosions or cruel revenge of brutalized men, but the methodically executed policies of government. Both kinds of atrocities occur in the brutalizing context of war, but the men who carry out atrocity by policy are in a different state of mind. They act not out of frenzy, bitterness, and frustration, but with calculation. Clearly, the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101, in implementing the systematic Nazi policy of exterminating European Jewry, belong in the second category, except for a few of the oldest men, who were veterans of World War I, and a few NCOs who had been transferred to Poland from Russia. The men of the battalion had not seen battle, or encountered a deadly enemy. Most of them had not fired a shot in anger, or ever been fired on, much less lost comrades fighting at their side. Thus, wartime brutalization through prior combat was not an immediate experience, directly influencing the policemen's behavior at J6ZEF6W. Once the killing began, however, the men became increasingly brutalized. As in combat, the horrors of the initial encounter eventually became routine, and the killing became progressively easier. In this sense, brutalization was not the cause, but the effect of these men's behavior. The context of war must surely be taken into account in a more general way than as a cause of combat-induced brutalization and frenzy. However, war, a struggle between our people and the enemy, creates a polarized world in which the enemy is easily objectified and removed from the community of human obligation. War is the most conducive environment in which governments can adopt atrocity by policy and encounter few difficulties in implementing it. As John Darr has observed, the dehumanization of the other contributed immeasurably to the psychological distancing that facilitated killing. For distancing, not frenzy, and brutalization is one of the keys to the behavior of Reserve Police Battalion 101. War and negative racial stereotyping were two mutually reinforcing factors in this distancing. Many scholars of the Holocaust, especially Raul Hilberg, have emphasized the bureaucratic and administrative aspects of the destruction process. 5. This approach emphasizes the degree to which modern bureaucratic life fosters a functional and physical distancing, in the same way that war and negative racial stereotyping promote a psychological distancing between perpetrator and victim. Indeed, many of the perpetrators of the Holocaust were so-called desk murderers, whose role in the mass extermination was greatly facilitated by the bureaucratic nature of their participation. Their jobs frequently consisted of tiny steps in the overall killing process, and they performed them in a routine manner, never seeing the victims their actions affected. Segmented, routinized, and depersonalized, the job of the bureaucrat or specialist, whether it involved confiscating property, scheduling trains, drafting legislation, sending telegrams, or compiling lists, could be performed without confronting the reality of mass murder. Such a luxury, of course, was not enjoyed by the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101, who were quite literally saturated in the blood of victims, shot at point-blank range. No one confronted the reality of mass murder more directly than the men in the woods at J6ZEF6W. Segmentation and routinization, the depersonalizing aspects of bureaucratized killing, cannot explain the battalion's initial behavior there. The facilitating psychological effect of a division of labor for the ing process was not totally negligible, however. While MRS of the battalion did indeed carry out further shootings, eagle-handed at Sarakamblottelsen and Koch, and later in the greater than Urs of innumerable Jew hunts, the larger actions involved adventures and splitting of duties. The policemen always greater than vided the cordon, and many were directly involved in driving Jews from their homes to the assembly point and then to the trains. But at the largest mass shootings, specialists were night in to do the killing. At Lomazi, the Hewis would have me the shooting by themselves, if they had not been too drunk finish the job. At Majdanek and Poniatoa during Ernstfest, the security police of Lublin furnished the shooters. The deportations to Treblinka had an added advantage psychologically. Not only was the killing done by others, but it was done at sight of the men who cleared the ghettos and forced the Jews onto the death trains. After the sheer horror of J6ZEF6W, the Leisman's detachment, their sense of not really participating in being responsible for their subsequent actions in ghetto tearing and cordon duty, is stark testimony to the desensitizing effects of division of labor. To what degree, if any, did the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 represent a process of special selection for the killer task of implementing the final solution? According to recent research by the German historian Hans-Heinrich Wilhelm, considerable time and effort was expended by the Personal Department of Reinhard Heydrich's Reich Security Main Office to select and assign officers for the Einsatzgruppe, and Himmler, anxious to get the right man for the right job, was also careful in his selection of higher SS and police leaders and others in key positions. Hence his insistence on keeping the unsavory Glubachnik in Lublin, despite his past record of corruption and objections to his appointment, even within the Nazi vertical bar L*KRTY. 7. In her book Into That Darkness, a classic study of Franz Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka, Jidisrani concluded special care must have been taken to choose just 96 of some MOO people to be transferred from the euthanasia program in Germany to the death camps in Poland. 8. Did any similar policy of selection, the careful choosing of personnel, particularly suited for mass murder, determine the makeup of Reserve Police Battalion 101? Concerning the rank and file, the answer is a qualified no. By most criteria, in fact, just the opposite was the case. By age, geographical origin, and social background, the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 were least likely to be considered apt material out of which to mold future mass killers. On the basis of these criteria, the rank-and-file middle-aged, mostly working class, from Hamburg, did not represent special selection, or even random selection, but for all practical purposes negative selection, for the task at hand. In one respect, however, an earlier and more general form of selection may have taken place. The high percentage 25% of party members among the battalion's rank and file, particularly disproportionate for those of working class origin, suggests that the initial conscription of reservists long before their use as killers, in the final solution, was envisaged was not entirely random. If Himmler at first thought of the reservists as a potential internal security force, while large numbers of active police were stationed abroad, it is logical that he would have been leery of conscripting men of dubious political reliability. One solution would have been to draft middle-aged party members for reserve duty in higher proportions than from the population at large. But the existence of such a policy is merely a suspicion, for no documents have been found to prove that party members were deliberately drafted into the reserve units of the order police. The case for special selection of officers is even more difficult to make. By SS standards, Major Trapp was a patriotic German but traditional and overly sentimental, what in Nazi Germany was scornfully considered both weak and reactionary. It is certainly revealing that despite the conscious effort of Himmler and Heydrich to amalgamate the SS and the police, and despite the fact that Trapp was a decorated World War I veteran career Rissmann and Alter Kampfer who joined the party in 1932, he never taken into the SS. He was certainly not given command of Reserve Police Battalion 101, and specifically assigned to the Lublin district because of his presumed suitability, a mass killer. The remaining officers of the battalion scarcely evidence a legacy of careful selection either. Despite their impeccable party credentials, both Hoffmann and Wolof had been shunted into GPO track careers by SS standards. Wolof's career in the order police, in particular, was marked by mediocre, even negative evaluations. Ironically, it was the relatively old 48 Reserve Lieutenant Gnade, not the two young SS Capuans, who turned out to be the most ruthless and sadistic killer man, who took pleasure in his work. Finally, the assignment of Cadet Reserve Lieutenant Buchmann could scarcely have been made / anyone consciously selecting prospective killers. In short, Reserve Police Battalion 101 was not sent to Lublin murder Jews because it was composed of men specially elected or deemed particularly suited for the task. On the contrary, the battalion was the dregs of the manpower pool available at that stage of the war. It was employed to kill Jews, as it was the only kind of unit available for such behind-lines duties. Most likely, Klubachnik simply assumed as a matter of course that whatever battalion came his way would be to this murderous task, regardless of its composition. If so, he may have been disappointed in the immediate aftermath of 6ZEF6W, but in the long run events proved him correct. Many studies of Nazi killers have suggested a different kind of selection, namely self-selection to the party and SS by unusually violence-prone people. Shortly after the war, Theodor Adorno others developed the notion of the authoritarian personality. Feeling that situational or environmental influences had already been studied, they chose to focus on hitherto neglected psychological factors. They began with the hypothesis that certain deep-seated personality traits made potentially fascistic individuals particularly susceptible to anti-democratic propaganda. Their investigations led them to compile a list of the crucial traits tested for by the so-called F scale of the authoritarian personality: rigid adherence to conventional values, submissiveness to authority figures, aggressiveness toward outgroups, opposition to introspection, reflection, and creativity, a tendency to superstition and stereotyping, preoccupation with power and toughness, destructiveness and cynicism, projectivity, the disposition to believe that wild and dangerous things go on in the world, and the projection outward of unconscious emotional impulses, and an exaggerated concern with sexuality. They concluded that the anti-democratic individual harbors strong underlying aggressive impulses, and fascist movements allow him to project this aggression through sanctioned violence against ideologically targeted outgroups. 10. Zygmunt Bauman has summed up this approach as follows. Nazism was cruel because Nazis were cruel. And the Nazis were cruel because cruel people tended to become Nazis. 11. He is highly critical of the methodology of Adorno and his colleagues, which neglected social influences, and of the implication that ordinary people did not commit fascist atrocities. Subsequent advocates of a psychological explanation have modified the Adorno approach by more explicitly merging psychological and situational social, cultural, and institutional factors. Studying a group of men who had volunteered for the SS, John Steiner concluded that a self-selection process for brutality appears to exist. 12. He proposed the notion of the sleeper, certain personality characteristics of violence-prone individuals that usually remain latent but can be activated under certain conditions. In the chaos of post-World War I Germany, people testing high on the F scale were attracted in disproportionate numbers to National Socialism as a subculture of violence, and in particular to the SS, which provided the incentives and support for the full realization of their violent potential. After World War II, such men reverted to law-abiding behavior. Thus Steiner concludes that the situation tended to the most immediate determinant of SS behavior in rousing a sleeper. Erwin Staub accepts the notion that some people become arbitrators as a result of their personality. They are self-selective, but he concludes that Steiner's sleeper is a very known trait and that under particular circumstances most PI have a capacity for extreme violence and the destruction. Human life. 13. Indeed, Staub is quite emphatic that ordinary ideological processes and normal, common human motivations certain basic but not inevitable tendencies in human thought feeling are the primary sources of the human capacity for SS destruction of human life. Evil that arises out of ordinary thinking and is committed by ordinary people is the norm, not one for exception. If Staub makes Steiner's sleeper an exceptional, Zygmunt man goes so far as to dismiss it as a metaphysical prop. For men, cruelty is social in its origin much more than it is characterological. 15. Bauman argues that most people slip into roles society provides them, and he is very critical of any application that faulty personalities are the cause of human loyalty. For him, the exception, the real sleeper, is the rare individual who has the capacity to resist authority and assert oral autonomy, but who is seldom aware of this hidden strength till put to the test. Those who emphasize the relative or absolute importance of situational factors over individual psychological characteristics variably point to Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment 16, screening out everyone who scored beyond the normal age on a battery of psychological tests, including one that measured rigid adherence to conventional values and a submissive, uncritical attitude toward authority, i.e. the F scale, for authoritarian personality. Zimbardo randomly divided his homogeneous normal test group into guards and prisoners, and placed them in a simulated prison. Though outright physical violence was barred, within 6 days the inherent structure of prison life, in which guards operating on 3-man shifts had to devise ways of controlling the more numerous prisoner population, had produced rapidly escalating brutality, humiliation, and dehumanization. Most dramatic and distressing to us was the observation of the ease with which sadistic behavior could be elicited in individuals who were not sadistic types. The prison situation alone, Zimbardo concluded, was a sufficient condition to produce aberrant, antisocial behavior. Perhaps most relevant to this study of Reserve Police Battalion 101 is the spectrum of behavior that Zimbardo discovered in his sample of 11 guards. About 1/3 of the guards emerged as cruel and tough. They constantly invented new forms of harassment and enjoyed their newfound power to behave cruelly and arbitrarily. A middle group of guards was tough but fair. They played by the rules and did not go out of their way to mistreat prisoners. Only 2, i.e., less than 20%, emerged as good guards who did not punish prisoners and even did small favors for them. 17. Zimbardo's spectrum of guard behavior bears an uncanny resemblance to the groupings that emerged within Reserve Police Battalion 101. A nucleus of increasingly enthusiastic killers, who volunteered for the firing squads and Jew hunts. A larger group of policemen, who performed as shooters and ghetto clearers, when assigned but who did not seek opportunities to kill. And in some cases refrained from killing, contrary to standing orders, when no one was monitoring their actions. And a small group less than 20% of refusers and evaders. In addition to this striking resemblance between Zimbardo's guards and the policemen of Reserve Police Battalion 101, one other factor must be taken into account in weighing the relevance of self-selection on the basis of psychological predisposition. The battalion was composed of reserve lieutenants and men who had simply been conscripted after the outbreak of the war. The non-commissioned officers had joined the order police before the war, because they hoped either to pursue a career in the police, in this case the Metropolitan Police of Hamburg, not the political police or Gestapo, or to avoid being drafted into the army. In these circumstances it is difficult to perceive any mechanism of self-selection, through which the reserve battalions of the order police could have attracted an unusual concentration of men of violent predisposition. Indeed, if Nazi Germany offered unusually numerous career paths that sanctioned and rewarded violent behavior, random conscription from the raping population, already drained of its most violence-prone individuals, would arguably produce even less than an average number of authoritarian personalities. Self-selection on the basis of personality traits, in short, offers little to explain the behavior of the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101. If special selection played little role, and self-selection seemingly none, what about self-interest and careerism? Those who Carrot admitted being among the shooters did not justify their behavior vertical bar on the basis of career considerations. In contrast, however, the issue of careerism was most clearly articulated by several of those who did not shoot. Lieutenant Buchmann and Gustav Michelson, in explaining their exceptional behavior, noted that unlike and our fellow officers, or comrades, they had well-established civilian careers, to return to and did not need to consider possible negative repercussions on a future career in the police. 18% Nan was clearly reluctant to have the prosecution use his arch-oeuvre against the defendants, and thus may have emphasized greater than the career factor as constituting less of a moral indictment of men who acted differently. But Michelson's testimony was not influenced by any such calculations or reticence. In addition to the testimony of those who felt free of career considerations, there is the behavior of those who clearly did not. Captain Hoffman is the classic example of a man driven by careerism, crippled by stomach cramps, psychosomatically induced, at least in part, if not entirely, by the murderous actions of the battalion. He tenaciously tried to hide his illness from his superiors, rather than use it to escape his situation. He risked his men's open suspicion of cowardice, in a vain attempt to keep his company command. And when he was finally relieved, he bitterly contested that career-threatening development as well. Given the number of men from Reserve Police Battalion 101 who remained in the police after the war, career ambitions must have played an important role for many others as well. Among the perpetrators, of course, orders have traditionally been the most frequently cited explanation for their own behavior. The authoritarian political culture of the Nazi dictatorship, savagely intolerant of overt dissent, along with the standard military necessity of obedience to orders and ruthless enforcement of discipline, created a situation in which individuals had no choice. Orders were orders, and no one in such a political climate could be expected to disobey them, they insisted. Disobedience surely meant the concentration camp, if not immediate execution, possibly for their families as well. The perpetrators had found themselves in a situation of impossible duress, and therefore could not be held responsible for their actions. Such at least is what defendants said in trial after trial in post-war Germany. There is a general problem with this explanation, however. Quite simply, in the past 45 years no defense attorney or defendant in any of the hundreds of post-war trials has been able to document a single case in which refusal to obey an order to kill unarmed civilians resulted in the allegedly inevitable dire Punishment 19. The punishment or censure that occasionally did result from such disobedience was never commensurate with the gravity of the crimes the men had been asked to commit. A variation on the explanation of inescapable orders is putative duress. Even if the consequences of disobedience would not have been so dire, the men who complied could not have known that at the time. They sincerely thought that they had had no choice when faced with orders to kill. Undoubtedly, in many units, zealous officers bullied their men with ominous threats. In Reserve Police Battalion 101, as we have seen, certain officers and NCOs like Drucker and Hergert tried to make everyone shoot initially, even if they subsequently released those not up to continuing. And other officers and NCOs like Hopner and Ostman picked out individuals